Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Saying welcome back. It's been a couple of weeks, but we got the gang together here, and so we're putting together an episode for you. And I think this one's going to be fun. We actually chatted in the Slack today a little bit and got ready for this. It's almost like we know what we're doing here. So we'll see how that translates into an actual episode. Going to do the quick run around the table here with who I've got on the screen in front of me. I'm going to start from my right. Robert Koshy, good to have you with us tonight.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Eric Darling Bond, how are things in Arizona?
Things in Arizona, it's been a rainy week here so far in Arizona, so it's a good one.
Yeah, it's a little bit different too. We've got Dylan Holzmer. Dylan, how are things in I was about to say Elvis's home, but it's so much more than that there in Memphis, right?
It is. Currently, we're having the existential crisis of the Memphis Tigers not being in March Madness, the college basketball tournament that we are partially hosting at the FedEx Forum downtown.
And so nobody knows what to do with that, right? At the end of the day.
My wife's from Baylor, so at least we've got a little bit of excitement in town because they're playing tomorrow.
Yeah, and we won't mention the fact that two of us here on the podcast are University of Houston graduates. It's not like we're not influencing anything in that direction. And last and certainly not least, I want Chris to say hi to the good people.
Hi, good people.
All right, now it's officially an episode. So today we're going to take a little trip in the Fork in Time Wayback Machine to do a little changing of history. We're going to go find ourselves back in 1803. We're going to find ourselves in all places of Washington, D.C., and we're going to talk about I guess it probably is the first most important landmark Supreme Court case. At least that's the way it was taught to me in a number of classes in both high school and then in college for my degree in political science. But since it's a court case, we have an attorney who's a part of the team. It only seems appropriate that Dylan would tell us about Marbury v. Madison, and then we're going to take a little trip down what would have happened if things had gone a little bit differently. So Dylan, take us away.
Yeah, thanks, Don. So Marbury versus Madison is basically the first most influential case of U.S. Supreme Court history, probably the most influential one outside of a small handful of others, like, not in any positive or negative connotation, but, Dred Scott, Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board of Education, Citizens United that says corporations are people. It's up there with the greats. The short version of what happened is we're at the end of the Adams administration going into the Jefferson administration. John Adams has a bunch of so-called midnight appointments that he's making to the first round of newly created circuit judgeships. They're called midnight appointments because supposedly the rumor is that he was signing literally at the stroke of midnight before Jefferson was going to get sworn in, trying to get a bunch of Federalist judges in there. One of the guys that he appoints, a guy by the name of Marbury, tries to go show up to his fancy new Justice of the Peace gig in Washington, D.C., and Thomas Jefferson and his Secretary of State, Madison, say, no, you don't get to do this. This is not legit. Sorry, we're going to pick our guy. Marbury's understandably not super happy about this, so he files a suit at what is then essentially the only court around, the Supreme Court, asking for a writ of mandamus. Basically what that is it's an English common law and American law writ, basically a document, an order from the court forcing a public official to do something, in this case, forcing Madison and Jefferson to recognize that Marbury was in fact a judge. So what the case is actually about is not what it becomes famous for. Becomes famous for this concept of judicial review, the idea that the Supreme Court can declare laws unconstitutional, that they violate the Constitution and are thus void or illegitimate. When in reality, what this is this is a political office dispute. He's just saying, hey, I want my office and these mean people won't let me in. Court, please tell them to open the door so I can go sit at my fancy new desk. And Marshall basically just completely sidesteps the mandamus question. He says, through some, quite frankly, from a legal point of view, some kind of hoop jumping that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We're not going to get into it too much because it's going to be kind of esoteric, but he basically says the whole concept of us issuing a mandamus in this case is not possible, even though the law says that we can do it, which means that if the law says that we can do it, but we can't do it because the Constitution says we can't, therefore the law is unconstitutional, meaning that Marbury, you don't get your appointment, but we get the power to say what is and what's not unconstitutional. So in essence, everybody but the Supreme Court kind of loses a little bit, and the Supreme Court wins, but it establishes the modern judicial system as we know it, where the court is the functional third branch of government alongside the executive and the legislative. So the idea in our situation is, what if that changes a little bit? What if, in this case, Marshall decides that maybe we're going to issue that writ of mandamus? Whether or not judicial review still comes up, he's going to say, you know what, I'm a Federalist. Screw you, Thomas Jefferson. I'm going to put my buddy as a justice of the peace and just see how you like it. So the idea is that the writ of mandamus, instead of just being sidestepped and declared that it's a law that they can't follow, what if the court decides to actually issue that mandamus? What's the fallout that's going to be caused by that for the rest of American history, considering that this is a government that's functionally less than a decade old in the way that we understand it? So this is still the formative area of the country. It's going to be really interesting to see what that might do to sort of careen us off into unknown territories.
And also undergoing the first real transfer of power.
Correct.
Oppositional transfer of power.
Yes, and the change from a truly sort of non-party affiliated government to the beginnings of what becomes the first party system.
That didn't take long to come into being, did it? Washington warns against it, and boom, we have it. But it didn't take long to be. Dylan, great summary. That's better than any summary I got from any college professor in college in terms of brevity and being on point. So I think
That's
there's
because
something
we skipped trying to go through the case. That's why it made so much sense.
Well, and to some degree, to a degree, isn't that what Justice Marshall did? He sort of skipped going through the case too to get what he wanted to do at the end of the day.
Yeah, Marshall, this was one of Marshall's pet projects. He'd, from what I was looking at, he'd been trying to get a case that he could basically ramrod this idea through, and he just so happened to finally find one in Marbury versus Madison.
Yeah, so I have a couple of questions there just to make sure I understand this, because what was unique about it was there had been a judiciary act that had been passed. So that was the law in question that they invalidated as being unconstitutional. And the original jurisdiction, the fact that it went directly to the Supreme Court, we're so accustomed to this idea of a federal district court going to an appellate court, from an appellate court to the ultimate appellate court, which is the Supreme Court. The reason that it went straight to the Supreme Court was it happened in the District of Columbia for a position, and they had original jurisdiction. Do I have that right because of the way it was written?
Correct. So they have original jurisdiction because it's a question of federal officers and sort of the interpretation of that.
Okay.
However, it becomes this sort of
not that the question of who's a federal officer hasn't come up. That's
a question that is going to actually currently very relevant for reasons we won't get into, but it's a much more modern question. But I'm using the legal phrases lowercase quote unquote federal officer, which is ironic that this is federal original jurisdiction. Basically, real short Schoolhouse Rock summary of the judiciary section of the Constitution. The Supreme Court either has original jurisdiction or it has appellate jurisdiction, meaning that it either is the first court that you go to hear cases, or it has to be appealed from a lower court before it can hear cases, depending on the type of case. The problem is, when the country was originally founded, there were no other courts. So they got to create them first. The Judiciary Act is the first, this is the first of a series of acts that starts to do that becomes in question here. So in theory, this is the Supreme Court having original jurisdiction over a case, but in reality, this is one of the things that allows us to make this change in the timeline, because Marshall has to interpret whether or not this is in fact original jurisdiction or appellate jurisdiction. The Constitution, and I'm not going to quote it, I'm just going to paraphrase it. It basically says that original jurisdiction lies in the Supreme Court when there are issues where the state is a party. So somebody is suing a state, or two different states are suing each other, or foreign dignitaries are basically one of the parties. The Constitution doesn't use the phrase foreign dignitaries, though. It uses ambassadors and consuls and other things. It does not say they have to be foreign. The United States has ambassadors too. So there is an alternate world in which Marshall reads this in a way that says ambassadors and consuls does not necessarily require foreign ambassadors and consuls. It can be native officers of the United States in any sort of administrative government role, which at a time when you don't have a massive federal judiciary could ostensibly include some of the very first, the 16 original justices of the peace. So that's kind of where he might ostensibly change his mind and decide, you know what? We do have original jurisdiction. We can issue this writ of mandamus, and Jefferson can just go blow on a raspberry. So that's the very short explanation of exactly what the Supreme Court is all about in 1803.
There you go.
Yeah.
Eric?
And for the good folks at home, I just want to remind you, if this seems very convoluted, remember, they kind of ran out of patience writing our Constitution during the convention. So a lot of things were just kind of written down sometimes without thinking through everything. So that's why we sometimes need acts of interpretation to understand, like, what is the spirit of what we are saying.
And really, that's the whole point here, is understanding the letter, because it's not exhaustive. I mean, the Constitution's a fairly short document when you realize what it's supposed to do, and what it, especially today as it's been expanded, what it covers. But then there's always the question of what did they mean by this word? What does that mean when they didn't say? You know, so the interpretation part, hence the judicial review, comes into play. So under our alternate timeline here, we've suggested is that now there is an order, the writ of mandamus, that has been issued by the court, and somebody has to go and enforce that, right? I mean, somebody has to actually make that happen. John Marshall doesn't go to Marbury's house and say, "Hey, you're a judge. Let's go seize your office." Somebody has to do that on his behalf, right? If it's going to be enforced, right?
Yeah,
Right.
although the Hollywood movie version would be very entertaining if you just had John Marshall and Marbury go on a buddy cop adventure.
Is that what Alex Garland's Civil War movie is going to be about, coming out in April? Is that what we're seeing as the future?
As long as we can agree that Jesse Plemons is going to play Marbury, yes.
Heck yes. But technically, the person supposed to be issuing it is James Madison, the Secretary of State. That's why he's listed as one of the parties in Marbury versus Madison. And for Marbury, one of his main arguments for it was, I don't live that far away. I live in Baltimore from DC. It is not a long journey to give me my summons. In this case, it's kind of like if the postman decided not to deliver your job offer.
Yeah,
in a very roundabout sense.
Yeah, and that actually is one of the arguments that he says, look, this is ridiculous if you had to get this delivered in order for it to be effective. It's like, this is something that's signed by the president. The president shouldn't have to be waiting on the mailman just to get the guys he needs to run the country into their offices, is basically what he says.
And it's the first court, and it still took them 2 years to finally issue a decision at a point when the country was smallest and there was no other really effective court system. It took them 2 years to get everybody together.
See, but I think that plays into what caused this to begin with. Remember the election? This election is the most contentious election we've ever had in our history. 2016 put aside for a moment. I'm sorry, 2020 put aside for a moment, because this one actually went to the House of Representatives in the only time it's ever gone there. And so you're looking at a court. Are they weighing the political pieces of this as they issue this ruling on some level? Which I think that's mainly maybe why it took 2 years to get done.
Yeah, and there was the 1828 election, which found its way to the House, and
I forgot about that one, Don.
Yeah, found Jackson coming back in force 4 years later.
Right.
Which is interesting that we should bring up Jackson here, because one of the things we were talking about on our podcast is eventually there is an instance in the real timeline in 1832, I guess it is, where there's a Supreme Court case that the decision that's issued in this case relevant, and the reason they had jurisdiction there was because it related to one of the states. It related to Georgia and actually the Cherokee tribe that existed in Georgia, and the outcome was not what Andrew Jackson wanted it to be. And so I think Jackson's famous response is, "Well, Mr. Marshall has made his decision. Now let him go make it happen," right? And it didn't. And so it was a case of where it was ignored here. So getting back to our original departure, as you suggested and laid it out there, Dylan, is this idea. I think the assumption is that Jefferson, as you say, is going to ignore this order because it's not what he wanted to happen, right?
Yeah, because this is so. Just to give a quick little tiny bit of context for why Jefferson, would ignore an order, coming from the Supreme Court of the United States from the Constitution he helped draft. John Marshall was basically, if he had not been on the Supreme Court, if he had made a couple of other decisions in his sort of political ascent, he probably would have been the post John Adams face of the Federalists, especially after Alexander Hamilton's untimely yet oddly musical demise. Because he had been a commander in the Revolutionary War. He was the interim attorney general for the state of Virginia at one point. He was a congressman. I want to say he got nominated or not nominated, but he was in the running for cabinet posts and as governor of Virginia potentially.
Secretary of State for a year.
Yeah, that's what it was, Secretary of State. So he has all of these bona fides for what in a sort of a partisan political system would make for the sort of de facto rising star of what we now would understand as a political party. So in 1803, even though Hamilton I don't think has been killed yet, Adams has clearly his star has basically been tossed in the gutter, and nobody knows what's going to happen in the face of this rising, Democrat Republican agrarianism that's taking forth. Marshall's kind of the guy who could say, you know what, this Federalist stuff is great. We're going to keep it by sticking it to Jefferson, and Jefferson can turn around and say, well, the court doesn't have this judicial review power. It doesn't exist in the Constitution. There's no enforcement mechanism. What are you going to do, Supreme Court, if I don't do this? This is the point, to analogize to sort of the loose history of many, fledgling democracies in like Latin America and, in Asia and Africa. Usually the moment when the destabilization starts to happen is when the judiciary starts to show cracks. That's one of the tools that any sort of destabilizing populist authoritarian, military junta, whatever you want to say, starts to, sort of become a possibility is when the judiciary is either irrelevant or impotent. So in this case, if Jefferson ignores this, we basically lose one of the three legs of our stool. And now you just become having to say, okay, what does the president do? What does Congress do? Does the judiciary even matter? What do y'all think? Do you think that the Federalists keep going after this if Jefferson ignores them and Marshall becomes, because Jefferson could just say, hey, why don't we try to impeach the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court since he's clearly issuing a biased ruling? Do you think he would succeed? Do you think it's something that would even be realistic?
Funny thing, they did. They impeached one of the Supreme Court justices that did sit on this case, and it failed in the Senate.
Yes, but his name was Old Bacon Face. So yes. I don't know that impeachment was really going anywhere because nobody's going to yell at a guy named Old Bacon Face. Let's be honest.
So you really think the fact that he was nicknamed Old Bacon Face would have swung enough senators?
I mean, you can't tell me it wouldn't.
I can't.
I think where Jefferson could make an argument is in ignoring essentially the Supreme Court is saying they were all appointed by an administration that lost after the first election. The fact that they're here for lifetime appointments doesn't make sense when they're not representative of the current feeling of a majority of the nation. He can say the legislative and the executive branch are better bellwethers for what is currently the mood of the nation. Why should we be beholden to what was the political feeling of one particular moment? Which will, of course, tie back into our series about what if we had a constitutional convention once a generation? Slight shout out to those episodes. But that is kind of Thomas Jefferson's main critique of the Supreme Court, is the fact that they're here for these permanent positions unless they either resign or are impeached, which is very difficult to do because nobody wants to set that precedent.
Or to go further back, it's
Yeah.
not explicitly enumerated that they have this power. The whole reason that the Anti-Federalists came about was they wanted the rights of individuals in relation to the state enumerated. If it doesn't say it, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Nothing
Exactly
says that
what
they have this
Thomas
power.
Jefferson, yeah. Now, will anybody say Thomas Jefferson didn't have a right to sell, to buy land from Napoleon? Well, things don't really apply to TJ.
He believes
rules are
it right
kind
up
of for other
until
people.
he believes it right up until it's
Thomas Jefferson didn't
Yeah.
believe it until Thomas Jefferson was able to do it. Is the way that I think about that.
Yeah.
And I think that's true of a lot of things. And this really is the crux of this, which is why I find this an interesting concept, because again, we can we can broach towards current politics in a way because we've seen some of these issues continue to manifest themselves in a lot of ways. And I'm not going to pretend for a minute that the American judiciary over the course of the country has not had politicization of it, and it has not had a role in politics, because it has. And that just thinks it would be otherwise. But it has been to some degree politically different than the other branches for the reason that it is, and had the unique position of being an independent judiciary that did stand as a third branch of the government. When you read the actual Constitution, it's not clear exactly how that would have gone. Marshall did a big grab here in terms of what he established, and everybody sort of went along with it. And for a long period of time, we've continued to go along with it with varying degrees, exceptions obviously that existed there. But the fundamental thing to me is just thinking this through, because it's, to me, having grown up as an American, learning from when you're a little kid about the Constitution, how great it is, and this wonderful thing that it is the Constitution didn't address this at all until this comes along. And so then the question is, if you don't have this dealt with in the way that Marshall did, and everybody goes along with it, the idea that you have this three-legged stool, you don't have a three-legged stool, you got a two-legged stool for the most part. And you're either going to have a president and a Congress that are aligned, where you almost have a tyranny type of situation that's easy to move forward, or you're going to have the other, which is the positive situation where they're not willing to get along and there's no arbiter, and neither one of those gets much done, from the way that I think about it.
Yeah. There's a wonderful YouTube series called Religion for Breakfast, where they examine different world religions and traditions. And in one episode, they did one about, does America have a civic religion? Kind of like how Rome made state service part of their faith system. In America, we have a system that kind of, for lack of a better term, deifies certain aspects of government and civil service, one of them being the Supreme Court of, if you want to talk about changing the Constitution or changing one of the rules, that is a monumental, undertaking, because we have no one ethnic group, we have no one class, we have no one really unifying thing other than the fact that we all agree, the Constitution. Constitution is the document.
So here's an idea then, just to throw this out there. So so say Marshall, issues the mandamus, decides to do what in this universe, because he's issued a mandamus that says to Thomas Jefferson and Madison that, hey, this Federalist judge who was appointed by the prior administration has to be seated. We're, correct me if I'm wrong, but are we not within the next 5 or so years about to have a constitutional convention to do the whole remove the whole runner-up is the next president thing, or is that later? And the reason why I'm going here is because, now we think of the whole process of amending the Constitution as this sort of nigh insurmountable task, just because of how many states, how many people, how many delegates have to be involved and have to vote for it. In 1803, we have a much smaller country to deal with much, for one, much less things to talk about in terms of the political spectrum. Not to say that they didn't have their own problems they had to deal with, but Twitter's not a thing. 24-hour cable news is not a thing. They if they really want to get something done, they can get off their butts. And this is something that in this situation, in this kind of super early American political environment, could ostensibly be done in terms of a constitutional change. So do we think that, what do we think about the possibility that, maybe Jefferson spearheads the idea of, do we change the Supreme Court appointments to, be even like a retention election where a judge gets appointed and then has to run every such many years to keep his seat? Or even if the Supreme Court keeps their lifetime appointments, does he spearhead a much more organized congressional, legislative push to create a elected sort of inferior judiciary? If he can't get the Supreme Court to run for election, well, what's to stop him from getting the circuit and appellate judges from having to run for election? Because if you don't vote for him on the Supreme Court's going to get picked from most of your appellate judges. So you're at least only one step removed from having these guys run for election to get their party affiliations.
So, thing is, we're not even talking about a constitutional amendment here. We're talking about a piece of legislation that to change the court, as I understand it, because
changing numbers on the court.
Yeah, that's where I was going. Is first
he packs the court.
None of these things you've suggested, I think, are necessarily enshrined in the Constitution. They come up in the Judiciary Act. And two, there's absolutely nothing saying he can't pull a FDR on this.
Yeah, I agree that I think what you would have is I think you would have more of a propensity to, through legislation or through constitutional amendment, you would have more of the political process for how these things would play out. Because again, not saying the judiciary is above politics. It's been a political element forever, but you had this way of changing what the Constitution means without actually having to change the Constitution. That's what judicial review and, you mentioned that series of cases there, Dylan, what you get in a Dred Scott decision versus what you get in a Plessy v. Ferguson versus what you get in a Brown versus Board of Education, are different ways of thinking about things over time as there's an evolution. And nobody had to go back directly. There were things that were relied upon. There were amendments that certainly happened, but nobody had to go back and change the Constitution to change what we think the Constitution means over time because of the judicial review process and getting this common law understanding that is enshrined through that stands next to the Constitution is the way that I've always thought about it. It's a way that we do. It's our flavor of common law, right? Because we have a written Constitution versus just the English informal Constitution that they have that works a little bit differently in how common law. We have common law, but it works differently here than it does in the UK, for example.
Yeah, and the other thing to remember, just the thing that we run into today is because it's always in the news of like, oh, is the court going to strike this law down as unconstitutional? Is it going to do, make this ruling and say this law is unconstitutional? The next time the court does this is Dred Scott in the 1850s. So it goes 50 plus years between the first time it says a law is unconstitutional and the second time. So even, that doesn't necessarily expressly state it, but it implies that even the court realizes that this is kind of a thing that, like, we don't have a real firm grasp on this. We're saying this, but we can't go banging this drum right out of the gate at, left, right, and center. We've got to be real careful about this. And so, if it's going to change, if it's not going to be enshrined as part of the sort of Constitution, the way we understand it, this is when that's going to happen. When judicial review is going to be a thing that people say, no, that's not the Constitution doesn't say you have that power. Nice try, but you don't get to do that. That's not how this works.
Yeah. In fact, the theory there might be that you may get the constitutional amendment that specifies whatever the process is going to be, reserving that to Congress or reserving that to whatever, explicitly saying not that you've assumed something that you don't have here. Now we're telling you for sure in the document you don't have the right to do this. So there's no doubt whatsoever. This is not just a debate, it's for sure. Robert, do you want to say something?
Yeah, what I'm seeing is the possibility of Jefferson actually doing a constitutional convention amendment process where all Supreme Court justices have to be reappointed and reconfirmed after each presidential election. In other words,
yeah. So you're basically arguing a retention reappointment.
Basically, yeah. You come in now, all of a sudden, this kind of goes along with his idea of a living constitution. So now Jefferson is reelected. This passes in the interim. He gets his second term. Every Supreme Court member has to be reappointed by him and reconfirmed by the Senate.
Which even gets into there, Robert, then even the question about interpreting the Constitution. What does advice and consent mean? Are you going to have to spell it out in some way that's different? Because now there's a question about who had, what does that even mean? Do they have to?
Got to get 5 senators to agree with me, and the Judiciary Committee sprinkles the water, and we're done, or do we need to have the full-on vote?
Yeah,
every time, because I could literally see Jefferson leaning that way with his writings, and after reading,
I think so. Yeah, I agree. So the question then is, if you have, in essence, what becomes sort of a slow rolling political change instead of sort of a glacial political change on the court, instead of having to wait until a justice dies, you at least have some change, even if it's not necessarily every 8 years. At least every 12 or 16, as different judges and stuff get changed, and as Congresses and Senates get recomposed, it becomes real hard to try and predict what would happen with some of the benchmarks of especially early American political history. But what kind of weird things do we think this is going to cause? Obviously, I think we could certainly think that, John Quincy Adams versus Andrew Jackson becomes a much more, up in the air debate. But I'm thinking even further than that, I'm wondering more about like what happens with Polk and the Mexican-American War, the annexation of Texas. Does that, dovetail into a whole other nightmare from what we're used to in our current day and age?
Dylan, the question you need to ask is, in the year 2000, are we still going to call them the Hanging Chads, which Chad is the most Florida name? And I have a second cousin named Chad, but that is a dumb name. And I'm sorry, Chad. I don't know where you are in this world, but I love you. But it's a stupid name, and I'm so sorry you were cursed with that. However, I think the thing we're lucky to have avoided this issue for so long, because there were so many times when Chief Justices, I'm going to use the example of not Grover Cleveland, it was Taft, who made it his principle when he was Chief Justice of, we need to be as united as a front on every decision, and we need to keep it within the bounds of acceptability to the American public, or else it's always going to be a constant fight for the court to be able to do anything.
Yeah.
So it'll be definitely more chaotic if now it's also going to be explicitly tied into, hey, so we had to change the vice president because our vice president murdered someone. Good job, American public. Versus... on top of, and now we get to appoint the new Chief Justice.
Well, and hey, whose trial did John Marshall preside over?
Oh yeah,
the other half of that aforementioned political musical demise.
Yeah,
how different does that turn out?
I think the short answer to your question, Dylan, is we have. It's not to say it's not to say that early 19th century American politics wasn't charged. It was. But I think you have a different way of the way that politicization and particularly the party growth would play out there. And I think the one thing you mentioned there, how long it was before the Supreme Court came back to really use this. If they were using it all the time, there would have been a pushback from that pretty quickly, obviously, as well. The fact that it was claimed by Marshall in a way. He claimed it, but also, as you said, nobody won in that case, right? Nobody got sort of at the end of the day what they wanted. There was, sort of the magic of that was he got what he wanted. He established the principle, but nobody else got what they wanted, and so nobody could say they won or lost really from the other side of things. But if it had been seized frequently, I think there would have been the definite political move back to say we're not going to do this because the party out of favor or the party in favor would have done that. So I think you would have had the more political expression. I think you would have seen more amendments to the Constitution. Legislation's not good enough because it's a level below the document called the Constitution. It's empowered by the Constitution. So if we're definitely going to get this in here, it's got to be at the constitutional level. So we may be talking about, and later in 1872, the 123rd Amendment said, kind of thing, because we would have been doing it more frequently. And I think you would have just seen more of that political back and forth up until my best guess is eventually it would have become so political and so unworkable that we would have thrown it out and replaced it with something else. I think that's the ultimate expression of it, is you would have seen the formation of an entirely different constitution or entirely different form of government, just because we would not be revering the Constitution and what it established quite the same way, because it would have been less workable. If that makes any sense.
At that point, our Constitution just becomes the arcane rules of the Senate, and I don't know anyone who can make 2 cents out of that.
Robert Byrd could, but he may have been the last guy who'd been able to pull it off, kind of thing, in terms of what all the things that were there were. And so I think we would have just we may have slid over to a parliamentary form, or who knows what would have been the expression of that over time. But I think we would not have kept the same, I guess, this is my long way of saying we would not have kept that same 3-branch fundamental layout of our political landscape necessarily, because if you go to change it 20 or 30 years later, you probably come up with something new or different, because the balance between the number of states, what you're trying to figure out most of the Constitution is a compromise. It's what it is because it's trying to fix something by not fixing it, kind of deal. That's why you have a bicameral legislature is, okay, we don't want it to be all about population, but we don't want to shortcut the states. Let's do both and see how that's going to work out.
Well, in our scenario, how does that little minor territorial people dispute in 1860 turn out? Or does it blow up much sooner? And does it end up splitting and not resolved?
So that was why I kind of brought up the idea of Polk in the Mexican-American War, because I feel like in terms of if you have a sort of, and I'm going to say more destabilized.
That was the tipping point for sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's probably a world in which, especially if you have a sort of more openly politicized Supreme Court who is involved in these sort of compromises that go with, westward expansion, assuming it even plays out kind of like how it did in our timeline. By the 1840s, you can imagine there's some pretty sour people on all sides that are just ready to, at least light some sort of torch and start setting things on fire to see what's going to happen. I'm curious. Eric Rush is having a birthday today, so he's not able to join us. So I'm curious if maybe we can use this early Civil War to give him a birthday present and kill Woodrow Wilson somehow, or erase him from the timeline somehow to keep everybody's least favorite president from coming to power. Or maybe we just make him a Supreme Court justice. I don't know.
Woodrow Wilson is our least favorite. Did we have an election on this one?
No, and that's why he's our least favorite, because this is not a democracy. I am John Marshall. It's law.
I forgot, Dylan, this is a democratic republic. That's correct.
We did have a vote, but Eric Rush challenged the incumbent Don, so Woodrow Wilson snuck in. That's how he did it. And yeah.
And I said this to the crew. I said this to the crew here, and this is an absolute true statement. Says along one of the things I've enjoyed about the fact is we now have a team and we do this together. It's not just me and not just Alexis, and as a result, I get to be a listener sometimes on the podcast that I helped found, which is a cool thing to do. And one of my all-time favorite episodes that Don is not a talking head on is Weekend at Woodrow's. So I'll put the link to that in the show notes if you haven't listened to that, and you'll understand exactly how we feel about the president that said we weren't going into World War I, and then suddenly we were. That's a whole other thing that goes into that as well. But it is our long-standing tradition. And Dr. Rush, who's not with us tonight, and happy birthday, Eric, is it's our long-standing tradition that we kill already dead presidents. That's what we do here on A Fork in Time, and we do it sometimes medically, but sometimes we're willing to go in other directions as well.
If we called it our peculiar tradition, would that be in bad taste?
I'm not going to touch that. I'm going to let that slide.
Given how many of us live in the South, we probably should avoid that.
Yeah.
Hey,
Yes.
that's not my problem. I live in the West.
Hey, you were in the part of the West that was arguably part of the South at one point. You don't get off scot-free.
Oh, my ancestors were Quakers on my dad's side.
Yeah, so
Don't
was
ask
Richard
me where
Nixon,
my
and look
mom's
how he
ancestors
turned out.
were.
Yeah.
I do have a story to tell about John Marshall, and I'll keep it quick. So when John Marshall got married, his dad bought him a slave who was about his same age named Robin Spurlock. And when John Marshall died, Robin was offered one of three choices. One, he could choose any one of John Marshall's children to become owned by. Two, he could move to Liberia and get emancipated, move to Liberia and have $100 to help him, or he could emigrate to another state and only get $50. The one thing Robin Spurlock wanted was his freedom, but also freedom for his adult daughter, who was going to go to John Marshall's daughter. And so Robin Spurlock, an 80-year-old man, chose to be owned by a daughter. Now that is John Marshall proving that even in death, he can't give someone what they want. I felt that was just like a very telling story about John Marshall's character, and I felt it should be included.
And it's interesting that you bring up Marshall as a persona, because I think, he's far enough back that I didn't know that story, for example, Eric. So, that gives me more of a picture on him, but I know other stories about him. Not only was he that early influential Supreme Court Chief Justice, he was Chief Justice for a long time. And so that court is a reflection of him as the person at the helm of it. I think we would all probably agree that that's a big part of what the court, him making the decision to do this, to claim this sort of uncharted territory. I claim this on behalf of this area of interpretation. I claim on behalf of the judiciary, planting the flag there, and then it not being challenged. But then he was also there to make sure that nobody unplanted that flag, if it makes any sense, because it was his stern hand that was on the way there. So back to this idea of, the appointments for life and how the court was not politicized, and there wasn't this process of, I'm sounding so much like our headlines today, let's impeach somebody. We don't like them, so let's impeach them. That's apparently what we do here as a country, from both directions. But I guess where I'm going here is, if you don't have this and you don't have the court that assumes that, and you don't have a personality like Marshall, is it just inevitable that we're going to see something different, because it's going back to this idea of whether this is the way that it would have been, or whether it's sort of that great man or that influential figure thing? Is Marshall's shadow a whole lot bigger than sometimes we recognize or realize that it is? And what we've discussed here in the alternate timeline is we've changed the angle of the sun and the direction that shadow is going to be cast, if you want to use that analogy in an extended way.
I mean, I think so. I mean, I think it's certainly not a stretch to say that, somebody who has that, especially in the early days of the Republic, somebody who has that long of a stretch on the court is going to have some, whether it's a good reputation or a bad reputation, he's going to have kind of some sort of gloss on his reputation. I mean, let's look at the guy who was Chief Justice right after him, who was Roger Taney, who is basically, at least in terms of legal perception by the public, is basically the Antichrist to John Marshall's Jesus, if you'll forgive the religious analogy. So it definitely tracks. I wonder if in our alternate timeline that would happen the same way. If people would become more on the lines of like a Henry Clay or a John Calhoun, who are recognized as having these, they're titanic figures, but with a very political bent, who have specific policy goals instead of these kind of lofty, neutral, to use all of the highfalutin lawyer words that we learned in law school, the arbiters of justice and all of that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, and then the other thing I think about, I remember the first time I was exposed to sort of American judicial history through looking at the landmark cases. What I remember is there probably are others in there. I know, Dylan, I'm missing some here, but it was sort of Marbury versus Madison, right? And the next one that was normally talked about, there were others, but you get to McCullough versus Maryland as being one of the next thing that comes along. And of course, that's where we got to think the phrase is the power to tax is the power to destroy, because there's a question there about whether a state can tax a federal entity or a federal institution. And the fact that Marshall has already claimed sort of the position for the judiciary, this was something that was for the jurisdiction of that court because it related to the power of a state, that gets decided, and that's decided, at least for a period of time, right? I mean, nobody really comes along later and says, that whole McCullough thing, throw that out. That was so last year. That was so late. I think 1819 is the year of that case, if I'm remembering correctly. That was so 1819. It's 1820 now, kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think that's just, as much as I don't think it's any stretch to say that at least in some sense we have sort of gone that way in terms of, now we're, much more, I don't know whether to use the word blatant or honest about what the Supreme Court is as a political institution. But at the very least, I think we would definitely see, you would see, instead of cases lasting as precedent for 50, 60, 70, even 100 years, you would see 10 or 15 years go by and everybody says, wait, no, let's revisit this. We're going to find a way to get this back in there. We don't like this. This is going to change. It's kind of one of those things that it's such a minor change in the landscape, but it has such huge ramifications. It makes it hard to even comprehend the differences that we would be living with today under, had we had 225 years of this weird alternate scheme that we're talking about.
Yeah, I don't think, again, back to my point, as I was thinking about after we sort of suggested the topic earlier today, we were trading comments in text to each other, getting ready for tonight, was it occurred to me, I don't think we have 225 years. I don't think it lasts that long. That's part of what the real timeline bought with what Marshall did and what was established here, was it brought for better or worse some stability to what was going on here. But I think we would have gone through, we may be like France. We'd be on our sixth republic now, for all we know, at the end of the day, because we would have kept reinventing ourselves in other ways to try to accomplish what we were doing, instead of altering the definition of what we had already decided in a way that it had flexibility, even if it's slow flexibility, that had flexibility to go with it. That's just my thought. I might be wrong.
Yeah, I certainly think so. Although I don't know if we would maybe be on six republics, because we don't have the Germans on our border. So I like to think that would at least, all due respect to France's 1,000 years of land army supremacy, but, and all due respect to our Canadian and Mexican listeners, I don't think we'd have to worry about that at the very least. But we might be on 3 or 4 at the,
What about Utah?
I'm just not going to answer that.
All right.
As a lawyer, I'm going to plead my what in our timeline currently still exists, Fifth Amendment right against recusal.
No. In honor of Dr. Eric Rush, what about Wyoming?
I don't know what that is.
It doesn't exist.
Neither does
no Wyoming.
Or do we have a constitutional amendment in our alternate timeline that declares that Wyoming does in fact exist?
See, now Eric heard that wherever he's at right now, celebrating his birthday, even though we're recording. He'll hear the episode tomorrow, but he heard that. Trust me, he heard that. The universe cast that out there, Dylan. He heard that. But I brought up the
Wyoming. Oh, go ahead, Donna.
I brought up the French situation only to say France ended up with its Napoleon, right? And I think under this scenario, the idea Washington set the precedent for giving power back, 2 terms and done. I think under this more politicized version of the early 19th century in the U.S., maybe Jackson becomes the American Napoleon, just as an idea there of this whole idea of we have a different structure, different system. I'm going to exert my power not only as the elected executive, more the imperial presidency may come earlier as a result of that than we see it. So I sort of intentionally chose that French example to say, I think you could have had the period there where it was a titular republic, but maybe not so much so. And it would morph in such a way to, I don't want to say that, I don't want to equate Jackson to Putin, but, you have this Putin-esque thing of, well, I can't be president for this long, so we'll change the structure here and I'll be something else. Because while Putin's been in control, for example, in Russia, he hasn't always been president. For a while, he was prime minister. It's just that they changed the roles to get around what the document said, right? For him to keep power.
Yeah, or it could be something where like you just have, sort of an Eric Ludendorff situation where, military qualification becomes kind of the de facto sort of proving ground for, presidenthood, whether it's a Democratic president, with some sort of election every 4 years, you especially once you start getting into I love that snap. What you got, Eric?
I have a wild idea.
George Custer as president. I'm all for it.
No, it's even better. We make Bushrod Washington Chief Justice and essentially turn the judicial wing into a monarchical third branch where he is now him and his chosen heir, a la the Romans, serves as a third-party intermediary between the executive and legislative branches.
So it's funny that you bring that up because one of the things I wanted to bring up before we end, and I know we're kind of closing out, but there are, out of all of the branches of government, the judiciary, at least constitutionally, has the fewest requirements on it. There's no requirement that you have been to law school. Technically speaking, there's no requirement that you even be a lawyer. So you literally could create a court of kangaroos and it would be completely constitutionally justifiable. So we actually could make this a reality.
And it's also the branch that has, if you will, the most monarchical bend to it in terms of a lifetime appointment. In terms of it doesn't have defined terms. In fact, the other irony that struck me is our founding fathers were very insistent upon you needed to be at least this tall to ride this ride. You need to be at least this old to hold this office. And because none of them lived long lives, it was a different era in terms of what longevity of life was. Nobody thought, what about the other side of that? In terms of how old you can be before and so as a result, we have what we've had and do have now, which are, a battle of octogenarians for the position. That was not what the founding fathers envisioned. You need to be old enough to have experience, not that you've got way too much experience. It's time to go do something else. The exception to that, obviously the elected office of the people choose that. They can elect anybody they want to at any age. But the other exception to that is a Supreme Court justice. Unless they get impeached, they're there until they decide they're not there anymore or they die.
Well, and that could be a way for politicians to keep, their hold on, like you mentioned in a Putin situation. Salmon P. Chase was a member of Lincoln's cabinet and then was on the Supreme Court. Taft was president and then became Supreme Court justice, or was it vice versa? I always get it backwards. But anyway, you could start seeing this very much bouncing between the Supreme Court and some other political. Oh, I love it. Okay, I want to see what you got.
Oh, no. We were equating Andrew Jackson with Putin earlier. And when Dodd said, well, sometimes he called himself president, sometimes prime minister, it reminded me of Jackson's quote, "Poor is the mind that can't think of two great ways to spell the same word."
I don't know how to handle that.
Having visited the Hermitage when I was in Nashville, that fits Jackson to a T.
He's actually to take the detour here, and we are coming up on the closer, so we'll close it out on the detour. He is one of when I actually sat down and made the list of 10 no longer living Americans I would like to have the chance to meet. Jackson's always on the list. He's not high on the list, but he always makes the list just because, Jacksonian democracy, his service as a general, is what he brought to a new take on the executive, all the things that are there. He makes the list. He normally comes in at like number 9 or number 10. Let me just be clear about that. But he's always in the top 10 because he's a fascinating character. He's a persona in American history, a character in some ways, almost a caricature of himself at various times too, which is what's there. And again, the irony being, is that he's the one we talked about who does defy a Supreme Court order and says, that's great. What are you going to do about it? And, where I bring this back around, why I thought it was relevant for us to talk about is that this has happened at various points in American history. And to some degree, it's happening now or could be happening now because of what's going on with the court. We could find ourselves in a situation like this alternate reality of the court saying one thing and other people just going, that's great. We're not going to do that, but that's great, kind of thing. So, those that don't study history are doomed to repeat it, or you've heard the thing about history and echoes and all that. I think this is a good example of that. It goes back to 1803 just as well as it applies to today. All right. I pontificated too much there, so now it's important for me to take a step back and ask if anybody else has any closing thoughts before we close it out here.
Feel free to cut this, Don, but shall we have our next constitutional convention in Eagle Pass?
Well, I will say this about Texas: we can get both primary candidates here in the same day. We'd still manage to do that. We got that going for us.
That is fair.
Yeah.
It's amazing to think about. As you said, Don, and for years and years as a corporate trainer, when I was doing retirement planning, we always talked about the three-legged stool of Social Security, pensions, and personal savings. And then we started chopping legs off because of changes. And just to imagine what we would have been without a Supreme Court that basically, for lack of a better term, mediated and we've had 46 presidents now, 47 presidents, 46, and 17 Supreme Court justices.
Oh, wait, 45.
Well, chief justices.
Yeah.
So think of that in that terms and the change that would have made in America. And I see Chris Coppola nodding his head along with that because it's a big difference.
No, that was the Grover Cleveland counting twice.
Yeah, there you go.
No, he was pretty two-faced.
I will say, to be fair to the Supreme Court justices, there is not a single lawyer on earth who has gone to law school to do math.
For better or worse, right, Dylan? It works both ways, right?
Especially considering what I do for a living, definitely for the worse.
That being said, there's this thing called bankruptcy attorneys that I'm getting very nervous about right now.
You should. I know plenty of bankruptcy attorneys. You don't want to know how bad most of them are, at least from my experience, at actually being lawyers. It's kind of scary.
I thought you were going to say math. But
oh, no. Yeah, that's why they're so scary, because bankruptcy is basically all math.
That's why our best president was a bankruptcy attorney who understood math, Abraham Lincoln. That's a shout out for the Donner Party episode where Lincoln was invited because they could only afford it because he helped them hide money during a bankruptcy trial.
Yeah, there you go.
We're getting all the references.
All the riffs and all the little subtle reference here that our long-term listeners will know. And if you don't know some of the things we refer to here, there's a whole back catalog to dive into here that'll help you with all of that. So, guys, I really enjoyed this. It was good to get the gang back together. I think this is an interesting topic, both for back then and obviously has some relevance today and how it connects together today. We have a couple of things that we know are coming up. If I begin to recognize our not participating other Eric here, Dr. Rush. I would be remiss if I didn't mention our live stream that we're coming up on our 200th episode. We're going to be doing something around our live stream regarding that. That's probably going to now be throwing into the April-May timeframe, but be looking for that. And then also we have a couple of revisits, I think, coming up here. For those of you that enjoyed sheep suffrage, I think we're revisiting sheep suffrage because there were some folks who weren't on that episode and didn't get a chance to participate. And there's some interesting things we want to pursue there. And the reason I mentioned that is part of the reason we're revisiting that episode was some comments that were made in our Discord, on our Discord server, where listeners suggested they'd like to see us circle back around in a particular topic that was there. So if you wonder if we sort of do read our listener mail, well, the equivalent of that is our Discord server, except for the email that comes to me. And trust me, we do, and we participate there and we interact with it. So we encourage you to go be part of that. And obviously, it helps if we get out an episode on a timely basis every once in a while again, so you have something new to talk about. We've been a couple of weeks remiss in doing that, but we encourage our listeners to visit that. All of that can be found at the website, www.aforkintimepodcast.com. We're due to come back around to a episode of The Room Where It Happened here sometime soon, so we'll be setting that up, trying to get that recorded here in the near term. But we need to get back caught up on our AFIT, as I abbreviated our Fork in Time episodes. So I'm going to say so long on behalf of Chris, Robert, Eric, and Dylan. And I'm going to suggest that if our listeners happen to come across a Fork in Time, what we think is a really good idea is take it and see what happens. Thanks, guys. Talk to you next time.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.